Hello friends, it's Shari, and today I have a fun card using one of the new stamp sets from the Ellen Hudson Summer of Stamping release. This is Everything's Beachy, and I really like these cute little surfboards. I'm going to do some watercoloring for my background, and I am no watercolor expert, but I'm going to take you along on my little watercolor journey, and I'm just using distress inks to do my watercoloring. I've got a piece of watercolor paper taped down to a board with some painter's tape, and I've created a line across the center that's going to be my horizon line, and I'm doing the bottom with some brown. So I'm starting out with some tea dye distress ink, and I just smushed it on my craft sheet to the side. I added clean water first, and then I picked up the distress ink. And I'm just drying between layers. So I'm adding a little more of that tea dye, and then I'm going to pull in some vintage photo, which is a bit darker. I'm going to start layering some dark on it. Now this one you can see I got my wet in a different place and I got this harsh line. So I'm actually just going over it with some clean water to kind of blend that out a little bit. So next I'm going in with that vintage photo. I'm just going to smash that on my craft mat off to the side, which I know is off camera. And then I'll just pick up some water and pick up the ink. And I'm just adding just a little bit. I don't want it too dark. I still want it to be a lighter sand color. And I'm just drying it with my heat tool in between. And then I will add one more layer just for a little more texture to this sand. And this is also still with that vintage photo, just a little more concentrated ink, and I'm just swiping it more instead of making a big spot of it. So once I have that dried, I'm going to pull back my tape. You'll see I have that nice horizon line, although I forgot I wanted to add some splatters. So this is just some brown watercolor with my Koi travel paint box here, and I've just picked it up with a small brush. I put that tape back down, and then I'm actually just going to use my packaging as a barrier to not get any of these splatters in the white part left on my paper where my sky is going to be. So instead of adding a bunch of tape or getting a piece of paper, this is a good way to just protect stuff. And then I'm also going to flick it off the side of a clear block. This gives me much smaller flecks of paint than when I just tap my brush. And then of course I'm just going to dry that, make sure it's nice and dry, because I'm going to be putting that piece of tape over top of the sand so that I can work on the sky above. So I've moved my tape to protect the sand part that I've already colored, and I'm going to do the same techniques with the sky. So I've got some salvage patina over on my craft mat. I've added some water to it, but before I take it to my paper, I'm taking some clean water and just adding that to my paper. Just making kind of a design at the top for a place for my color to flow. Then I can pick up that salvage patina and start dropping it into that wet area. And you can see how it blends out with that water, and you get this really soft blue. And you can pick up this board, move it around, and that color will move around with the water. But this is a really light layer, and it's a nice base for some color I'll add to it. So I want to start lightly, which this is extremely light, and then I'll add some more layers to it. So this next layer of color I'm adding, I'm using peacock feathers, which is much darker than the salvage patina. And I'm just swiping it across, adding a little bit of water to it to kind of bring that color saturation down a little bit. And then again, I'm drying it after I've got that darker color on there. And I like how it kind of gives you different variations in color versus just one solid color. You get that watercolor look. And my water did go down onto underneath my tape a little bit, and I think that's just because I had dried my tape, so it wasn't sticking quite as well. So you can see I have some imperfections along that horizon line, but I'm going to clean those up very easily with just a little bit of clean water and a small brush. So I've just got a little bit of clean water and I'm just going over the brown and it will blend it out. And it's going to be okay if it's not perfect because this is where my surfboards are going to go, so you're not going to see all that too much. It's going to get covered up by the images. So I've made sure this is dry, and then what I'm doing now is I've got some white watercolor and I've just picked that up with my brush. It's very, very soupy, not too pigmented, and I'm making some really light clouds in the sky. Now these are much more white right now as they are wet than they will be when they dry, but it just adds a little more texture and interest to the sky. And because this white watercolor is pigmented, they'll stand out a little bit. So for my surfboards, I am stamping them on a piece of craft cardstock with some Lawn Fawn walnut ink. And I need 7 of these surfboards. So the stamp stamps 3. So I'm just going to stamp this out 3 times. And it doesn't matter that 3 more don't fit on my piece of paper. That last one's going to get cut off because I only really need 7 of these. And I thought it would be fun to keep the craft color because that's kind of the wood of a surfboard, and just have the accents colored like those parts are painted. And so I'm using my colored pencils just to add color to each of these surfboards. And I'm just doing a rainbow of surfboards, so I'm staying in that rainbow order. I just like the look of the colored pencils on that craft paper. It's not too bright. And I'm trying to pick out lighter colors so they stand out really well on that craft cardstock. So I've got a red, orange, yellow, green. I've got a teal color. Then I'll go in with the blue. Worked out perfectly that the blue ends up on that wavy surfboard, which is my favorite of the 3. And then finally a purple one. And then just to add a little bit of shape and shading to the surfboard itself, I'm going in with a lighter cream colored pencil and just doing the edges of the craft part that's going to stay that craft color. And it just kind of gives it a look that it has some shape and they're not too flat. So now there is a die that will cut out this surfboard, but I wanted to cut right on the lines. I didn't want that extra little edge that the die creates because I want these to be nice and close to each other, and then you see that watercolor background through between them. So I just decided I was just going to fussy cut these. These are really simple shapes to cut, and so it didn't take me too long to cut out all 7 of these little surfboards. So you can see how nice this looks without that craft border that the die creates. So I'm just cutting out all of these surfboards and I'm just laying them in the order that I want them to be on my card front. And I thought that they could be perfectly straight, but I like the idea of them being a little bit crooked, like they're all just stuck in the sand. So I'm placing them in the arrangement that I want, and I'm just using a piece of micropore tape to pick them up because this is gonna pick them up very lightly and not tear the paper. And I'll just set them aside. And then I'm trimming down this piece just slightly so that I'll have a slight border on a card base. However, before I glue this down to my card base, I want to stamp my sentiment. So I'm going to pull my little surfboards, put them back in place. I happen to make the bottom of the piece of tape my horizon line, so I know exactly where they need to go. And then I'll put this in my MISTI and line up the sentiment that I want to stamp. So I wanted to stamp the sentiment in this set that says everything's beachy. And I just thought I would stamp that right above those surfboards. So I've got that lined up and picked it up with the door of my MISTI. And then I'll use some VersaFine black ink because it has that nice crisp impression, and I'll just stamp that right above my surfboards. So now I can put that background panel onto my card base, and I'm using liquid glue to stick this down. Since it's watercolor paper and I've added water to it, it's a little bit warped, not too bad, but I feel like this liquid glue will hold everything and keep it nice and flat to the card base. So I'm just lining that up so I have that really thin border on all four sides. And then I'm adding some foam squares to the back of my surfboards. I'm just cutting these squares in half so that they're not too wide. And then I can take the backer pieces off and just place them all at one time right where I want them. So this tape comes in very handy holding all these together. It's almost like it's one image. And I can just line it up, press down all those foam pieces, and then carefully peel this piece of tape away. And then here is my finished card. I just think it's so fun. I love those surfboards and that watercolor background. Thanks so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.